So I sped up the playback of this section just so it's not so tedious. I'm just going to start creating shells for these parts. So these are the arms right here. So I'm going to use the edge selection tool to select an edge in the inside of the arm, cut it, and then unfold it. And that's all I need to do for the arms right there. It works well enough. So I'm going to start taking looks at the other parts of the body. I'm going to save the armor for later, just working on the parts of the monster, or creature rather. So here's the torso, same thing. Selecting a edge, cutting it, and then unfolding it. I selected an edge in the back where it's less noticeable. So those parts are pretty easy. Hands are only slightly more tricky. In this case, I'm going to use the 3D interactive cut tool. I like this tool. I mean, you could do the same thing just by selecting edges, but the reason I like this tool is it allows you to just kind of make decisions while you're working. It's just a slightly more artistic approach to creating seams on a mesh. So I'm just kind of examining it and then figure out my strategy. I'm going to use the interactive cut tool and just draw a seam along the edges of the fingers here on the inside. And, just along here. And then stop right there. Actually, just get a little bit more of the thumb. The top of the thumb, I'll leave some of it uncut because I want one shell. And then I'll unfold it and it kind of just flattens it out and spreads it. So now I'm just using the sew tool to clean up any edges that need to be sewn together. That works pretty well. So that's the hands. So now I'm going to go to the trunk for the legs. This gets a bit more tricky because it's not symmetrical and there's a lot of clothing parts, the belt, the satchel, the pants, the buckles, and so on. So just to get some UVs to work with, I used normal base projection. I'm experimenting with the auto seam feature, but I'm not really crazy about the seams that it created, so I kind of got rid of that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the 3D cut tool to kind of cut the tail off of the rest of the trunk here. So I'm just drawing out, just like I did with the hands, some edges. And of course it gets a little tricky when we get to the underside here. Just being able to see all the edges. But you can see once it changes color, obviously now it's a different shell. So I'm going to switch to shell selection, move it off to the side. Those leftover bits are just the buckles. Now I'm going to create a seam just down the middle of it. In this case, you can just select the edges or whatever. And then cut those seams. And then I have two different parts. I'm going to unfold each part and glue them back together. I probably could have just done one edge on one side, but that's kind of just thinking on the fly here. But I ended up with that one piece for the tail. That works pretty well. That's nice and easy. This is where things get tricky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start just making shells based on what I think the most logical place for seams are. And this takes a little bit of experimentation. So you can see I'm kind of drawing them out and undoing them as I'm trying to figure out the best way to cut this model. So I'm going to go with this leg first just because it seems to be a little bit more straightforward. And once again, kind of working with the nether regions here, the creature, getting up close and personal. That's part of the job, This is how you get to know aliens really well, doing a little bit of UV work on their nether regions. And once the cut is complete, you'll see that the shell changes color. Sometimes you have to hunt around for that one edge that did not get cut. So it means working, just hunting around until you find it. And then once it's cut, you should be able to separate the shell. So I think this part, I was just having difficulty finding that one last little edge. So looking for it in wireframe, and I think I found it. And let's see. Yeah, so there we go. So now I can switch to shell selection mode and move it out of the way. And then this one should be fairly easy to unfold. Again, I'm just going to find a seam on part of the model that's probably not going to be as visible, and there's also kind of a straight edge that goes all the way down the surface, and then I'm going to cut that and unfold it. So there we go. That leg is done for the time being. And I usually just cut these things into sections and then go back over and start to neaten them up, or rearrange things, or maybe I'll change my mind about a few things. But the main thing is just to get some nice unfolded shells to work with from this 3D surface. And this one, if you look at the belt, there's a lot of sections where you kind of have loops and space between the belt and the object while it's still one mesh. So that makes doing just a straight unfold a bit trickier, which is why this particular section took a lot more work than the other ones did. So I had to kind of find the best way to create a complete edge loop that separates the pieces into different shells. And the nice thing about having that color mode is that once it changes color, I realized, or it's obvious now, that I have a different shell. So I've succeeded in separating that from the rest of it. So same process here, just going to find a seam in the back of the leg that's not super visible and use it to cut the shell and then unfold it into a flat piece. So for this part, since it starts to get more and more tricky, I came up with a few ways to just kind of make selection or separation of shells a little bit easier. So right now I'm trying to find the best possible path to cut it straight down in the middle, in the front and the back, so I can make two separate shells for each side of the trunk. And of course this gets a little tricky because the edge loops, they kind of wind their way across the buckles and the other equipment. So again, it takes a lot of looking around and making sure, trying to see which edges I may have missed in my cut, and then cutting them. And then I think this one was just this one little edge here in the back. So that's cut. Now I have that shell. I'm going to try unfolding it. That worked pretty well. This one, unfolding it, doesn't work nearly as well because it has kind of, again, those sort of loops or extrusions that connect the belt to the body. So I did a little bit of an experiment here where I tried just selecting the back faces and separating those into shells. So selecting the back faces and then use create UV shell. But in the end, it just was too messy, so I kind of undid it and went back to it being one piece because I just didn't think that worked very well. So another technique I tried was, and this worked a little bit better, is I'm using face selection mode to select face paths across the surface to separate the more obvious parts like the belt. Of course, it's being a little bit obstinate here, but I got it to work. So I just selecting face path below the belt that goes all the way across that shell. And then I'm going to choose create shell from that face path. So I can kind of cut it out there, and then I can just rejoin it later on when things are a little bit neater. So you can see I have they have the belt faces and then a little strip that's just beneath the belt. So I'm going to switch to edge selection mode and then see where I can join that little strip to the bottom of the belt there by using stitch together. So I stitched it together and unfolded it. Of course, now I'm saving the seams, which is always a good idea. So now I have a slightly neater little part for just that part of the belt. You can see when I tried to unfold the shell there, it turned into a perfect circle, which means it's not really, and is doing the best it can to unfold it, but it's not really working. So I undid it. Now I'm going back, selecting another face path, as logical as I can make it, given the topology. And I'm going to choose create shell for that face path, and then move it out of the way and unfold it. I'm going to have to find another face path just because it's not a completely separated section here. You can see some of those faces that go behind the belt there, those little edges, those little openings. So I had to select the back faces that are in those little openings and see if I can separate those out as well. So this is the part where UV mapping becomes more of a puzzle than anything else. It's not that much different than trying to find a good topology for a surface. It takes some experimentation and some messing around till so you get something that works well. So I think this one finally got it. Now I've got a shell I can move away, and then I do have some stray bits that I'll need to kind of sew back into the surface. So now I'm going to just try and work with the shells since they're flattened and see if I can start to join them together in something that's a little bit neater. I think what I ended up doing is I made a single shell from the entire trunk, which I don't know if that's the best idea, so I might change my mind later, but at least I have them, once I have them kind of cleaned up and into logical shells, and it's much easier to kind of cut them and rearrange them and resew them as needed. It's just that first step of just getting the initial shells together, which is the most tedious and the trickiest. So in this part of the process, I'm doing a lot of cutting out pieces and unfolding and then selecting edges and getting some of those stray bits to join or stitch together. So there's a lot of kind of experimentation here. So every time I successfully stitch together one piece, I'll either unfold the entire shell or just do a local unfold, or in this case just manually moving UVs out of the way for the moment. And then, looking for these little openings. Some of these openings you don't really want to close because they kind of join to other parts of the mesh in a weird way. This is going to create kind of a tangled up shell. So some of those openings I'll just leave as is, with sort of open edges. But in other cases, anytime I can create something that's a little bit neater, a little bit nicer seam along the edge, I'll do that. So again, very repetitive here, just selecting edges and UVs, unfolding, edges stitched together. So by selecting all the edges on the UV shell, I can look at the other shells and see which edges are highlighted. And then I'm kind of deselecting the edges that I don't want to connect. So it's like a process of elimination. So what I'm left with is the edges along the shells that I want to stitch together. So I'm just using selection as a way to kind of hunt down the connections between those parts. So now I'm merging these shells using stitch together as best as possible. It still looks like kind of a weird map of some alien planet or something like that. It doesn't quite look like pants or legs, but that's mainly because this part of the model is fairly complex. I'm doing an unfold there and getting close to just a few shells left. As I mentioned before, I think I merged all these shells together, which I might go back and change that later, just because it seems excessive to have everything merged together if it doesn't need to be. Plus, if you have, several medium-sized shells, it makes it a little bit easier to make a layout than if you have one big, massive, kind of weird-looking shell. It makes it harder to fit into the UV texture space. So it's always kind of a cost-benefit analysis that you have to do to figure out which makes more sense for having several shells or one big shell. And it just depends on your goal in terms of how you're trying to texture a particular piece. So right here, I'm just experimenting with different ways to cut up the shells and join them together. But I'm left with these 3 shells here, so I'm going to merge them into one shell. I think I leave the tail separate. So that's kind of one big shell for most of the trunk, with the exception of the tail. And then I'm just kind of seeing what I can neaten up here. In a few moments, I'm going to turn on the checker pattern and see what kind of warping I have as a result of this. So that's going to take some fixing as well. I probably could have done that part of the process earlier. I just got caught up. Right now, I'm just looking at any edges that could be merged together, like open seams. So I'm turning on the visibility of sort of to see the texture warping and the stretching to see if I could fix anything. And I can only get it, I'm trying to get it as good as possible. It's not going to be entirely possible to get it entirely white so that there's no stretching or pinching. partially because, again, I have everything as one big shell. So I'm kind of experimenting with the optimize and the unfold tool to see if I can spread it out a little bit more and decrease the amount of warping or pinching or stretching or however you want to refer to it. It's got a little bit of a overlapping section there that I'm going to try and fix here. So I'm using the move tool with soft select on just to kind of pull these things apart. Of course, you could also use the smear UV tool or smudge or whatever they call it. It's kind of the same difference. Just depends on how you like to work. This part gets pretty horribly tangled, so it's going to probably result in having to do some cuts here. Just, give up on trying to keep it as one big shell if it's not working. I'm just kind of pushing things around and seeing if the colors change at all. This is also part of the body that I don't think is going to be seen very often, but that's never. It's safe to make that assumption in some cases, but with video games, it's a little bit tougher because, of course, video games you have no idea how the model is going to be viewed by the end user. So I've turned on the checker pattern here, and I'm looking for warping parts. There are some pretty bad warps on the belt buckle here, so I'm going to end up kind of cutting these sections out so you can see how that checker pattern is really warped because of my desire to make everything one single shell. It's resulted in this kind of nastiness. So now what I'm doing is I'm selecting some faces, and I'm going to make a new shell from those selected faces and kind of cut them out here so that I can reduce the warping. I usually feel like the checker pattern is the ultimate, in my view, the best way to see where the problem areas are. So the goal is to get that checker pattern as uniform as possible. And that's usually a safe way to go. That kind of trumps everything else in terms of how you cut up the shells and the UVs and that kind of thing. So I'm just selecting some faces here, and I'm going to create UV shell and move it out and maybe do an unfold there. So I got some stray bits. I'm going to try and weld here using the sew button, or sew using the sew button. So now I'm kind of scaling it up and seeing where that warping is occurring. I'm selecting those faces, and I'm going to create a shell from the selected faces. So that's that thing right there that's causing the problems. So it just can't flatten out correctly. So I'm going to move it off to the side and kind of make a cut there and then unfold it, which will flatten it out. And it's looking a little bit better. It looks off because it's a different scale than the rest of the parts. So I'm going to do the same thing with this little part right here. I'm going to create a shell and move it off to the side, and then make a small cut and unfold it so that it's flattened out. Turn on the checker pattern, and it's starting to look a lot better. So I may keep those as separate parts. So for these little belt buckles, the little metal parts, these parts are really easy. I'm just selecting an edge loop since the topology is really even. Selecting an edge loop on the inside, then selecting another edge loop that goes around the surface and cutting those, and then unfolding it, and you end up with this large strip, this flattened strip. So that's pretty easy. It's kind of like what I did with the dreads before, same kind of technique. And once those are unfolded, since those are going to be metal, I mean, you could stack them if you wanted to. I think I'd leave them as separate shells just because I'm thinking, if you were going to paint like different scratch marks and dents and that kind of stuff, you wanted each of them to look unique, then you would not want to stack them, because if you stack them, then you're going to end up with the same texture on each one. Again, just depends on what your priorities are. So at this point, I decided that I have the seam on the outside of the tail, which I thought was a bad idea. So I cut a new seam on the underside of the tail. And then I'm going to stitch together. So I'm just kind of rearranging those shells and restitching them together, so that the texture seam is on the inside of the tail or the underside, so it's not as visible. And this part, I'm just kind of looking at the shell, trying to decide whether I want to keep it as one single shell or maybe cut it into several small ones. These are the little metal loops, little metal bits. So I'm going to try arranging them, or either along, line them along the U or stack them together. So I'm just reorienting. Same exact technique I used for the dreads here. I have one bit there that doesn't belong there, so I'm going to move that out of the way. It's part of the belt, not one of the belt loops, but I think I figured that out in a moment. Yeah, there we go. So that little highlighted section, those are the little belt loops or the buckles. So I'm just kind of align them, and I'm just moving them off out of the way. And now I'm just kind of playing with the arrangement here of these other shells.